Welcome to Unlocking Your Truth, another podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips.
Hello, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey.
Hello, everybody.
And we're broadcasting from CIVL on the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation on 101.7 FM. If you're new to the show, let me explain a little bit about what we do on Unlocking Your Truth. It's a talk show, and we talk about all topics under the umbrella of metaphysics and spirituality. And every week we have a different theme. And every other week we like to invite a guest onto the show who has some expertise to share with you and to inspire you. And so this week is no exception. Our guest today is Reverend Connie Habash. And she has helped hundreds of students and clients overcome anxiety and spiritually awaken. And she's been doing this for over 25 years. She's an experienced yoga teacher, a psychotherapist, an interfaith minister, and she helps people create transformation of body, mind, heart, and spirit. She teaches in workshops and retreats, and her specialty subject is, amongst others, awakening from anxiety. And she's actually written a book about awakening from anxiety. And the book is called Calm and Confident: 7 Spiritual Keys to Overcome Anxiety. And that's what she's here to inspire us about. We're going to talk about anxiety, and as we're talking, help you understand your relationship to feeling anxious about things, and whether you're somebody that's really prone to feeling anxious or not, and how that relates to your spirituality and what you can do about it. And so Connie's going to share with us some simple and accessible tools from our book to help us return to our calm and confident essence.
I'm all anxious about finding out.
Welcome to the show, Connie.
Thank you, Leslie and Corey. It's great to be here.
Well, it's a wonderful topic, and a topic that I'm sure it really affects everybody, doesn't it? Are there some kinds of people that are more prone to anxiety than others, do you think? Or is it just something that the human condition is susceptible to in general?
Well, I think there's both in the answer to that. I think right now, especially, we're living in high anxiety times for a variety of reasons, things going on in the world. There's, the internet, and things move along much faster than they did decades ago. But I also think that people who are on the spiritual path, who are interested in awakening and spirituality, are a little more prone to anxiety because we tend to be what's known as highly sensitive persons. We're very empathic. We care deeply about others and about the world and about nature, and we pick up on energy very easily as well. So for those reasons, I think that people who are spiritually oriented might tend to have more anxiety, stress, overwhelm, fear, etc. in their lives.
So does your book offer some tools and tips and techniques for those kinds of people having those kinds of experiences, how to cope and deal with that?
Yes, the book is written in particular for people who are on a spiritual path. And that I found that there's a number of things that spiritually oriented people, orientations or perspectives or thoughts or beliefs that they might have that might be spiritual principles, but used in a way that actually perpetuates their anxiety more.
That's really interesting. And I'd love to ask you more about that in a moment. But I think I'd also be very interested to find out a little bit more about you and your personal journey. Because often they say, either we teach what we need to learn, or we teach what the path that we've walked in our personal experience. And so how has anxiety affected your life, and what's your personal relationship and journey through
Absolutely.
that?
Well, I've definitely had a journey through it, and it continues. My part of my orientation is not that we're trying to get rid of the anxiety, make it go away, because that's actually part of what perpetuates it and keeps it going, is this resistance to it, or trying to shut it down or force it away. But that anxiety essentially is fear that's sustained or perpetuated over a period of time. Maybe a lower level than, say, strong fear, but it might be very intense when people end up with something as extreme as an anxiety attack. But it's something that's kind of constant, or over a longer period of time than just a momentary fear, like, a spider landed on me. That might be in the moment, but you may not be going around all day worried about spiders jumping on you. So at any rate, as I looked back on my life when this book came to me, and this book actually came to me last year, it came to me very quickly. In fact, I think I wrote it in about 5 weeks. It was sort of a download.
That's amazing, actually.
Yeah.
Being someone that's written books myself,
I did have help, though.
Amazing to write it in that short period.
I had help with getting very clear about the message. But I realized that I had anxiety back even when I was young, when I was a child, because I was pretty shy. I didn't feel very confident with my peers, confident to speak up, to certainly to speak in front of people. But it was sort of this low level kind of unconscious thing that was in my life for many years, until I had a baby. And I'm sure that those of you who have had kids can probably relate to this, because when you have a child, all of a sudden you realize the enormity of this responsibility for this life. And it started in my labor, that I had a very long, difficult, very painful labor. It was about 18 hours, which is pretty long. I know people who've had longer and worse, but by most standards, that's pretty long. And it was, I was quite frankly terrified. I didn't expect, even though I had prepared myself, I'd done all the courses and the hypnotherapy and all of that. I thought I was well prepared, and I'm a yoga teacher, right? So I thought, well, I'm a yoga teacher, I'm a yogini, I'm pretty flexible, I should be able to birth this okay. No, this was tremendously painful, and the labor was not progressing the way it was supposed to. And I did not want to have a C-section. I mean, if I had to have one, of course, I would do that. But it was just very, very frightening. And so that started this, a number of different situations that brought up more anxiety. My daughter, for a little while, they thought after she was born that she wasn't breathing quite properly. And then I was afraid about her breathing. So I'd find myself at night, the moment I heard any sound she made, I'd be up, out of my bed, like a thunder shot, right? Like a gunshot, out of my bed, down the hall, or to her crib, wherever she was, if she was next to me. And it started to get more broad in my life, to where it translated to fear of flying. So before I had my daughter, I was fine with travel. I didn't really like when there was turbulence. I found it a little bit uncomfortable, but it didn't stop me from going anywhere. But after I had my daughter, the fear was much greater, and I avoided flying for about 2 years, until finally my husband's family was like, "Are you gonna bring the kid so we can meet her?" Besides when they came here shortly after she was born, and so we went. When I would get on the plane, it happened actually several days beforehand, I'd go into all this fear, and I'd be nervous, and my digestion would get upset. And then, getting on the plane, I'd start to feel extremely tense and shaky. And then when the turbulence happened, because that's what I was mainly afraid of, my palms would break out in this cold sweat, and the fearful thoughts would be running. And so I finally realized, I don't want this to cause me to shut down my life of going anywhere. I went on that one trip when she was 2, and after that I didn't fly for a few years, and I just said, I've got to get over this. And really what forced me to get over it was that my mother, who lives on the opposite coast from me, started to have problems. And I knew I'm going to have to fly to see her, and I'm probably have to fly to see her regularly. So I got to get a handle on this. And this was back in, I think, 2010, somewhere around there. I took a fear of flying course that they had here at San Francisco Oakland International Airport. But all this time, I had been working with clients with anxiety and depression and other issues, and been on my own spiritual path for a number of years, been a yoga teacher for a number of years. And going through that course and overcoming the majority of my fear of flying, I realized, okay, there are definitely things that work, that calm this anxiety, that shift me out of fearing the fear. That's part of what can perpetuate it, is having anxiety about the anxiety. And I might talk a little bit more about that later.
And judgment about it as well.
Exactly.
Resistance to it.
Exactly. All of that can perpetuate it. But I started to become real clear about the things that were working, that helped me overcome the anxiety, integrating my years of yoga training, integrating a number of other spiritual practices that I have, such as presence and embodiment and work with energy and nature, all of these kinds of things, to where it really started to become this, I don't quite call it a method, but you might say that it's a method or a way that I work with my clients and work with my students to help them move through this. And frankly, any kind of intense emotion can be worked through in a similar way. So that's my journey here today, to where does anxiety show up in my life sometimes? Sure, it does. And does it rule my life now? No. Now I know how to work with it, how to move through it, how to embrace it, and how to learn from it, what spiritual and personal growth lessons it's bringing to me.
I'm really curious about, I guess I can understand how the birth experience, having such a tough experience giving birth to your daughter, triggered the anxiety. But I'm just curious what the connection would be between the fear of flying, which came about after this first level of fear, that quite literally is the fear of death.
Absolutely.
So what's the connection? Do you think there is a connection? I imagine there is.
It was directly connected to the fear of death. So, and I write about this in the book, that the yogic term for the fear of death is called abhinidesa in Sanskrit, abhinidesa. And it's known as one of the 5 causes of suffering. That when we are suffering, when we're afflicted with pain, fear, anxiety, that is one of them, and one of the biggest ones, right? Like the fear of death and the fear of public speaking are, I think, the 2 biggest fears for people, right? Not necessarily in that order. But so it was a fear of death. It was a fear of, like if my daughter was traveling with us, of course it was a fear for her life and making sure I protected her life. And it was a fear of my own death, not so much for myself, but how would my death affect her?
Exactly.
That I didn't want this child to grow up without a mother. Yeah. So it just amplified that fear of death in ways that I hadn't before, because before I had her, I was like, sure, I'm afraid of dying, but then to have someone else who's dependent on you, and you know that your life will matter significantly to them and will affect them tremendously if you die. That brought it up in big relief.
Yeah, so I can see that, see the connection, and also just thinking about some people I know and watching them go through becoming a mum. To me, it seems
I take it Corey knows who you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, I've observed what you're talking about in other people, that this amplification of anxiety for yourself and for the child. And
it happens in more than just childbirth, though, Leslie.
Yes.
I mean, marriage is a great example. Even serious relationships, starting jobs. It's incredible what can amplify anxiety and fear in your life. Sorry, I interrupted you.
That's okay. Yes,
otherwise, I never get a word in there.
I obviously agree with you, Corey. I was just curious, in Connie's experience, what proportion of first-time mums go through something like that?
Everybody.
Yeah, a tremendous amount, a large amount of them. And certainly the ones that come to see me in my practice.
Yes, yeah.
They pretty much across the board have some form of that fear of, the impact that they will have on their child's life. They have anxiety about doing it wrong. I'm not being a good enough parent. Everybody has that pretty much to one degree or another who's a parent.
Yes, yeah. Now, you use a term called high functioning anxiety. And I imagine that describes also a large proportion of the population, whether it's the go-get-it career person or
yes.
Other types of people. So tell me what you mean by high functioning anxiety.
Well, it's a term that's been used recently, probably in the last 10 years. And I live here in Silicon Valley. And so I see a lot of what's called high functioning anxiety, where people are pretty successful, they're go-getters, they're, raising a family and have a business, or they have a career, and they're, taking their kids everywhere to all their soccer games, etc. I mean, they're doing, like, everything on the outside looks like they're doing great. They have a nice house, but on the inside, they feel like they're constantly on the hamster wheel. They feel like they're treading water, trying to keep above the overwhelm and the stress. So they're highly functioning, and they're not, debilitated completely by their anxiety. They're not, in the bed with their covers over their head, although sometimes maybe we might feel like we want to do that. But they're out there doing everything that seems right, but inside, it never relents.
Yes. And so inside it never relents. And is it being amplified, perpetuated, originated by the thoughts and the beliefs, which then amplify into the emotional levels? Is that how it's?
Yes, that's absolutely how I see it. And one of the things that I talk about with my clients and my students that I demonstrate in the book is that a lot of times we aren't actually giving ourselves space to feel the anxiety. Mm. And this usually surprises people, because they come in and they're like, but I'm overwhelmed with my anxiety. I'm feeling it all the time. And
they're in a whirlwind in their mind with it.
Let's look more carefully at this, because what I usually find is that they're thinking their anxiety. Yeah. They are caught up in constant thoughts about the anxiety and thoughts that perpetuate the anxiety. And the feeling of the anxiety is actually somatic. It's actually in the body through physical sensations. And pretty consistently, I find that when I'm able to help people feel the sensations in their body and let go of the train of thought or not engage in it, then the anxiety can start to move through the body in the way that it was intended to do and start to release.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'd love to talk more after the break about the solution to all of this. So listeners, you're listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and we're broadcasting on CIVL. There's going to be a short break for some ads, and we'll be back with our guest, Reverend Connie Habash. Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey. We are a talk show about metaphysics and spirituality, and today we are having a delightful conversation with Reverend Connie Habash. And we're talking about something that I'm sure has affected most, if not all, of our listeners.
Yeah, you hit home on a few interesting points before our break, Connie, or Reverend Dr. Connie.
No, I'm not a doctor, and you just call me Connie.
Ma'am. When you look at the area that we're speaking about, anxiety, I mean, to me, anxiety, stress, and fear are all quite related. Mm-hmm. Yet fear, the understanding between fear and anxiety, there's a difference. Like, fear is actually motivational. For instance, your mother, if you saw your little girl or little boy, you have a little girl or a boy?
I have a daughter.
A daughter. So if you saw your daughter at a young age run into the street with a car coming, well, instantly, there's no thought, right? You don't have thought. In most situations, maybe you let out a scream, but adrenaline kicks in, and you run out and you grab your child to come in, and of course, what were you doing? You get all upset, and in most cases, people verbalize that. That's the purpose of fear. Fear is an adrenaline rush that we use to since we've been in existence to stay alive. Whereas anxiety is a consistent nagging that people consider fearful, in the sense of imminent issues or things you've done in the past that are irking you, and it's a fine line, but there is a big difference. Do you find fear and anxiety different and easier to one or the other easier to overcome for people?
Well, as I said, anxiety is more of a perpetual state of fear, or kind of a consistent experience of fearful thoughts. But you bring up a really good point, Corey, because definitely fear has a purpose, right? It has a purpose. It's a survival mechanism, as you said. And what I distinguish between is the two types of fear. There's fear of the known, which that's what you're talking about. If you're by a street, the known fear is that a car could come over and hit you, right? A car could drive by and hit you. If you're out in the jungles in India, there could be a Bengal tiger. Like if there's a tiger coming after you, you better hightail it out of there. There's a reason that fear kicks in. So that's known fear. We know something that is there to be afraid of, and we have to take action and do something about it. The other kind of fear is fear of unknown fear. And that is what anxiety generally is founded on, is this fear of the unknown. What if? So it's either based on an experience we had in the past, like, oh my God, my kid almost got hit by a car. And so then we might start to have anxiety anytime you're near a street, especially if you have your kid in tow, right? So it's either going back to the past and that, oh my gosh, could that happen again? That's an unknown. Or projecting forward into the future, right? You could be taking the past toward the future and projecting into, oh, well, what if there was a big grizzly bear as I'm hiking out in these woods? So what if there is something there? What if I don't get this job? What if I couldn't pay the rent next month? What if, what if my thoughts, one of the things I talk about that causes anxiety for some spiritual people is, what if I'm thinking the wrong thoughts and then I'm creating a bad experience? And then you get anxiety about that you might be having imperfect thoughts, or thoughts that create a bad reality. So these are all fear of the unknown, or unknown fears. And that's generally what causes the anxiety.
And that type of fear is not motivational. That's the type of fear that frees you in your tracks and stop you.
Shuts you down. Yeah. Exactly.
But the interesting thing is when you look at it, so I don't ski, and somebody takes me up on a hill, puts a set of skis on me, and I'm looking down this hill, right? There's fear. This is fear. This is like, I could kill myself doing this. There's a true fear. So what happens is your body temperature goes up, so you start to perspire, you start breathing heavy, and your body tenses up. So another day, I'm going on a first date, I'm a young person. I'm going on a first date. Haven't been out with this girl before. I really like her. What happens? I start to perspire. I start breathing differently, and I tense up. And the interesting thing is, those two things are quite different in their level of love, if you want to call anxiety or fear. One is actually fear, and one is actually anxiety, more or less. But you touched on it earlier. Both of them have the same or similar physical attributes.
Well, they are, and actually, I would suggest that they're actually founded in the same thing. We talked earlier about the fear of death, and when you have the fear on a date, about going on to a date, I mean, let's look a little bit deeper at what the fears might be in there. I'll just make up some. Oh, she won't like me. Oh, this won't go well. Oh, I said something stupid. Oh, do I have something in my teeth? I mean, you could go on and on and on, right? But what's really underneath all of that? It's in a way, it's a fear of death. It's a fear of death of the self, that somehow who I am is going to be obliterated if they don't like me, or if it doesn't go well, or if I sound stupid. Underneath all of that is this fear of loss of self, which is another level of fear of death. And I'd also go back, Corey, to your example on the slope, that you're standing at the top of the hill and you're afraid, but nothing's happening. You haven't gone down the hill yet. You haven't hit a tree. Nothing has happened yet. So it's based on the unknown of what could happen, what might happen, and what we start to project as happening in our mind. Now, if you're a beginning skier, and I am too, I think I've skied once in my life, I think in 7th grade, I would probably have the symptoms you're talking about, depending on the height of the hill someone took me up on. And we can use that fear to discern, all right, should I be doing this? If I choose to do this, how am I going to do this? What's going to be the safest way to do this? But nothing has happened yet. That's all projection into the future. What the real key to overcoming the fear is coming into the present, into the now. What is happening right now? I'm standing here at the top of this hill. I have choices. I could take off my skis, walk in my ski boots over to the lift and go back down. I mean, like nothing's happened yet. Or I could go down the hill very carefully. There's options, but all of that is based on everything that's not in the present moment.
Yeah. It's interesting that you touched on the fear of public speaking. Actually, the fear of public speaking is also a fear of death.
Exactly.
And it goes back ancestrally to when we were basically caveman or tribal. And what would happen is, around the campfire at night, people would tell stories. And you would be picked to tell a story. And if somebody from another tribe came in to spy or whatever it was, or in that sense, and he were picked, he would be found out. And at that point, the penalty usually was death. And so that fear of public speaking became predominant in every generation from there on forth, and that's the basis of that. I found that very interesting.
That is fascinating, and that completely is in alignment with my understanding of the fear of public speaking, and that I think we do fear in some way dying of it. So it's interesting.
So I think we're all agreed death is the biggest fear that there is. And I'm just curious, are all fears ultimately, when you drill down to the core underlying belief or source or origin point, are they all ultimately a fear of death, or are there some fears that are unrelated to death?
I think in some way they all drill down to that. I really do. And then, that brings up the question of what is death, right? Because I imagine between the three of us and a lot of the listeners being spiritually oriented, we have a perspective on death that's not as scary and not as obliterating as that. So I think that there's a deeper fear even than death of annihilation, of non-existence.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Non-existence. And or not being, especially in the case of public speaking, not being seen clearly not being seen and known and accepted for who you are, and not. And I guess you're not, if you're fearing public speaking, you're not believing in yourself.
Yes, and now I'm thinking about it. It's possible that there might be other fears, but so if we're going down, to fear of death, fear of annihilation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think back to the 5 causes of affliction in yogic philosophy, which are called the kleshas, the 5 causes of suffering or affliction. The first and foremost is ignorance, is not knowing our spiritual truth.
Right.
Right. And so I thought of, perhaps another fear that may not necessarily be the fear of death, but maybe it was related to the fear of dying, is the fear of pain and suffering.
Yes.
Right. And that is related to that ignorance, which is called avidya in yoga, in Sanskrit, that, who is it that suffers, right? Our body is in pain. Is that necessarily suffering? There's actually a difference between pain and suffering, according to many spiritual teachers. And that we create the suffering by how we think about what we experience, right? So there may be in addition to the fear of death, the fear of pain and suffering.
Yeah.
Actually, the fear of death is only number 6 in the list. Fear of flying is the first, and
is it really?
Fear of public speaking. I just brought it up on the computer while we're talking, and it runs this way on this particular site. The fear of flying, the fear of public speaking, the fear of heights, the fear of the dark, the fear of intimacy, fear of death, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of spiders, and fear of commitment.
So we've touched on several already.
We have, and the one that stood out on that list, fear of intimacy.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Which I think is another subset of fear of annihilation, because I think one of the reasons why people have fear and anxiety about getting close to someone is losing the sense of self and getting kind of taken over by the relationship or by the other person.
Or they believe that they are evil and will be found out.
There you go, that too.
That's a large fear with men. I was at Leslie's heard the story. I was at a weekend event, and it was a men's event, 156 men, and the gentleman that was giving the seminar at that point, he got up there and he says, every morning I wake up, every morning I go to work, and every morning I have the same feeling. One day I'm going to be found out. One day they're going to figure out that I don't know what I'm doing or talking about. And he says, and I said, I associated with that. It hit me home, and I said, yeah, that's me. And so 156 men in the audience, and he said, how many of you feel that way? And, I went to put up my hand. I said, but I don't know. And I looked around. Everybody, every single man in that audience had his hand up. And it's so true. We did seminars with thousands of people afterwards, and that question comes up every time. The men group would always put everybody, they have that same anxiety, that same fear that they don't know what, somebody's going to figure out that they're fakes, that they're imposters. Whether it's with their wives, whether it's with their relationships, whether it's with their friends. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting, the psyche behind fear.
I've just thought of another fear.
Of course you did.
Loneliness. That's the one that's my biggest one, actually, more than fear of death. Loneliness. And we had a lady on the show who'd written a book about fear of loneliness. So I think that's a big one.
I think that is a big one. And what that touches on for me is, so if we fear being lonely or experiencing loneliness, that speaks to disconnection, that we won't have a sense of connection with others or with the divine.
Yes.
And so part of the process of awakening from our anxiety and helping to release the anxiety is cultivating a deeper sense of connection within, with ourselves, connection with the divine, connection with the planet, and then connection with others.
Interesting. With women, when you look at the base fears, with women, the base fear is abandonment. or loneliness, if you want to look at it that way, Leslie, Dr. Leslie.
Yes,
and with men, it's the loss of freedom.
Yeah.
When going into a relationship.
What Connie said about loss of connection with God, I resonate with that as well. Like you, I've done a lot of years and years of training, spiritual devotion and all of that. And I remember when I found, at the moment after my training, when I really found that connection and I had that deep connection and I felt really connected with God and source energy, then there was like, and I don't know if it was a fear, but I suppose it was, that I don't ever want this to ever be taken away from me.
Right. Fear of losing something that, you know, is meaningful to us, so that we love, or that's been in a profound experience like that.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of a client that I had who had done a lot of meditation and mindfulness practices and got to this really nice, calm, peaceful state within herself after we had worked together for some time, and then went on this trip. And during this trip, there was some bad flights. So back to the fear of flying issue. And lost the state of calm. Right. And thought, like, what have I done? And came back just dejected. Like, did all of that for nothing? And I've lost it, and I feel like a failure and all that. I said, you know, no, you're right on track. We're all going to lose it again. We're going to gain that peace again, and then we're going to lose it again. That's everything changes. So embrace that. You know, you had fear come up. That's very natural. That's very normal. And you can also come back to your calm and anxiety by doing what you were doing before. But you didn't do anything wrong, and you're not a failure. It's just get back on the horse again.
And I think that this is a really common story or loop that spiritual people get into. This idea that you reach a state of perfection, but you hope not to be knocked down from, when really what it is about is riding the up and down waves of planet Earth and the polarities, because everything's changing. We're getting in and out of balance. And really what a true spiritual master knows is how to manage that and how to get back into balance after they've got knocked off their horse. So with that, let's go and have a few more ads come up because we love ads.
Because we love ads.
Okay, let us be here and have the show.
when we come back after that, and we're in the last section, I think we should really focus on some solutions, because I know Connie has lots of solutions, and at least 7 principal solutions that are in her book. So that would be what we should talk about then. So we'll be back shortly, listeners. You're listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey. Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and with our guest today, Reverend Connie Habash. And she's an expert in many things. And we're not even touching on some of the areas that she has a lot of knowledge on. But what we're really doing today is picking her brains about anxiety, because she's written a book about anxiety called Calm and Confident, 7 Spiritual Keys to Overcoming Anxiety. And so, Connie, I believe you've probably already shared at least one of your keys, which I picked up on when you were talking about being present and being in the present moment. What are the other keys that you talk about in your book that can help people who suffer from anxiety, which is most humans?
One of the important keys is embodiment. And I imagine that you will be able to relate to this on the spiritual path again, because one of the things that I think can happen for people who are trying to awaken is that they leave their body. And they go into these, states of meditation or visualization, or they like the idea of actually getting out of this body, because this body can be uncomfortable and it can be stressful. It can go through pain and all of the things that we experience as being human beings in human bodies. But the very act of leaving our body, sometimes, especially if it's a defense mechanism that's used constantly to deal with stress, is that the body can become panicky. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like, if you think of your body like a toddler, let's say a 2-year-old, and when you have a toddler, you need to stay close by. You need to be near them, or a baby certainly, right? And if you left them in the house alone for a couple hours, what do you think would happen? Well, they'd probably be panicked and they could get hurt. They could get seriously injured. Yeah. And so when we're constantly leaving the body, and this isn't just for people who are on the spiritual path doing out-of-body experiences. I mean, a lot of people are not embodied.
Most people.
99% I think so.
Of humans.
Yeah, even people who are athletes are sometimes not embodied. The body becomes panicky. It's like nobody's home. Who's here running the ship? I'm here dealing with this physical world and you're out of me. Come on, I need you to come back here. And the body itself, physiologically, the nervous system can get agitated by the experience of sensing that the soul is not really in here.
I completely agree with you. It's your body. You're meant to own it. You're meant to be in it. And that's why on this show we really advocate grounding and the forms of meditation where you stay in the body and clear out the dross within the body to give you and your body a healthier partnership. So that's great. So we've got being in the present moment, being embodied. What else?
Well, I mentioned earlier about feeling your anxiety. So actually, before I get there, let me talk about another key in the book before I get to the step of feeling your anxiety, which is self-compassion.
Yes.
This is something that's become more well-known now in the last 20 years. There's been research done on self-compassion. It's been something that psychotherapists are starting to engage more with their clients. One of the leading experts on it is Kristen Neff, who I am inspired by her work. But self-compassion is, the ability to be able to be present with yourself, with that love and compassion and understanding that you might have for someone else. So we know that as spiritual people, we know compassion is an important spiritual value, right? We know that it's essential for us to be compassionate toward other people, other beings, but we don't often extend that to ourselves, and quite often when we're in a state of anxiety, we're not being compassionate with ourselves. We're beating ourselves, I think you mentioned this earlier, Leslie, we're beating ourselves up for it. Like, why am I feeling anxiety? I should be more involved than this, right? I'm on a spiritual path. I shouldn't be feeling all this anxiety. Or, if people knew that I was this fearful and anxious, so they would think I'm an idiot or something. I mean, all these judgments, rather than what we need in that moment is to stop and, I'm putting my hand on my heart right now as I say this, and being there for ourselves in our heart and saying, I get that you're feeling afraid right now, and I'm going to be right here with you. I'm speaking to myself as I'm feeling this fear and this anxiety, and breathing and all of the embodiment practices that I talk about in the book. But self-compassion is essential.
Yes, and I think that they're all related, aren't they? But
yes.
The other thing I thought of, and I encounter a lot with my clients who obviously are all very spiritually focused, is and I guess it's a facet of compassion, and it's a facet of what we're talking about with embodiment, which is they have a tendency for all their energy to flow out into giving and looking after other people. They forget to give to themselves and receive for themselves. So that whole giving receiving thing is out of whack and out of balance, meaning their energy is out of their space looking after other people. So that's not being embodied, and it's also not being self-compassionate either.
Absolutely.
So it's like a martyrdom type
right.
thing almost.
one of the things I talk about in the embodiment chapter is filling our energy body, and that it's absolutely true that we tend to be out there giving, serving, sharing our energy with other people, and we deplete ourselves. And that when we take the time to really fill our energy field and keep healthy energetic boundaries, and then let infinite source come in and fill us up.
Yes.
Then when we're filled, then as we keep that channel open to keep receiving that infinite energy, then we have overflow, and it's the overflow that can go to other people, not depleting our personal energy.
Exactly. All right, so let's do a quick recap. So you've told us about being in the present moment, being embodied, feeling. Oh, well, we were going to talk about feeling,
right,
and being self-compassionate, and then the next one was feeling, and then there's 3 others as well. So,
right.
So tell us about why we should feel into our anxiety.
The reason why we need to feel into our anxiety and feel it in a helpful way rather than the thinking our anxiety. So a lot of times we believe that we're feeling it, but what we're doing is just thinking about it over and over and over. So feeling it in a bodily sense helps the anxiety move through its life cycle. So
right, because if you're not feeling it, you're resisting it and you're pretending it's not there, and that keeps it stuck.
Exactly, it keeps it stuck and actually starts to build it. It gets dammed up behind that resistance.
Yeah.
So I find that emotions in particular, like anxiety, have a life cycle similar to a wave, and that there's a period of time where they're arising and they're building up like a wave on the ocean, and then it crests and then it rolls in, and that's the most tumultuous time, right, is when the wave is rolling in, and then it slides up on the shore and then it gradually recedes. So emotions are like this. They have a life cycle. They are not permanent. It's one of the big fears that people have, is that this will be forever. It will never stop. It'll never end. I'll be depressed forever. I'll be anxious forever. And it's not true. That when we learn to become present with it and feel it compassionately in our bodies, that it has a cycle that it moves through, and I find that it can move through very quickly. It can take a couple of minutes, or it can take 30, 40 minutes, when I'm working with someone.
Yes.
I can help them move through that. But there's always some sort of shift, and it may not go away completely, but just to notice that it does shift in some way, that's empowering. That it's always going to change if we are willing to stay with it long enough.
That's really wonderful insight and guidance. So
we know on the spiritual path that everything's temporary, right?
Absolutely.
Except for the infinite divine presence,
right,
which is eternal, but everything else changes, and anxiety is no different.
Exactly. If there's one thing that we can certain won't change, is the fact that we're going to be always changing.
Exactly.
So what are the other 3, Connie?
So then after feeling the anxiety, we move into listening to the anxiety. So I, being sort of a suburban mystic, find everything meaningful. And I'm always looking for, what's the message, what's the gift, what can I learn from this stain on my carpet? I can make up all kinds of things and they will have a gift or a meaning for me. So our emotions are no different, and certainly anxiety comes up for a reason. Now, sometimes it comes up for a very good reason. You need to get to safety. There might be something real that you're afraid of, but most of the time when we're dealing with anxiety, it's that unknown anxiety. It's what we're manufacturing. So what is it trying to bring attention to in the way we're thinking, in the way we're perceiving, in how our needs are getting met or not getting met, in whether we're caring for ourselves or not? So I spend time with my students and clients discerning, what do you hear from this anxiety? What is it trying to tell you that it's trying to bring your attention to? What are you needing right now? Maybe there's a spiritual message that's trying to come through. Maybe you've been trying to go, I was talking to a friend of mine about this the other day, trying to push to go north. I want to make this happen, and I'm trying to go north. I want this particular thing to result. And we keep running into stumbling blocks. And I'm sure you've been there before, right? There's something I wanted, and I kept trying to force it to go there. And sometimes the anxiety comes up to show us, you need to go east, not north. You're not going in a direction that's in divine flow.
Right.
So it's discerning what's the message, to listen to our anxiety to figure out what is it trying to tell us.
Wonderful. And we've not got too much longer left. So even though I'd love to probe more about that one, I think we should move on to the next one.
So the last two, the sixth key is empowering action. So that once we discern what the message is, then what's the appropriate response? Because when we're in anxiety, we're in reaction all the time. We're reacting out of fear. So when we can discern what is the message here, or what am I needing, or what's appropriate action, then we figure out a baby step to take in that direction. Now, sometimes, having said appropriate action, and I write about this in the book, sometimes the right action is no action. Is being willing to sit and be still for a while and wait for the action to arise, or the message to come, or the direction to be revealed to you. So in that chapter, I talk about discerning between those two things. And then the last step, which I think is the most powerful step, but can also be maybe the most challenging step, is surrender. Is the surrendering to the divine, surrendering to something bigger than us, to carry us through this, and to trust the process in that.
And that's when wonderful things start to happen, when you completely surrender.
I have found that again and again.
Yeah, me too. So Connie, it sounds like a fantastic book. It sounds like a really, really wonderful book with just brilliant information. How can our readers access it?
Well, you can go to my website, Awakening Self, like yourself, SELF.com, awakeningself.com.
Great name.
Thank you.
Excellent name.
Thank you. I've had that name I think I've had that website for over 20 years now. And it's available on Amazon in a Kindle version starting January 17th. So when this show comes out, it will be available. So you can look up Calm and Confident book, or Calm and Confident Connie Habash. It'll show up there, and you can download it. And let's see. Yeah,
is that the way for them to contact you as well, to go to your Awakening Self?
Awakening Self website. I'm also on Facebook, /Awakening Self. I'm on Twitter with Awakening Self as well. Or I think I'm Connie Habash, Connie.Habash or something like that on Twitter. But you can find me through any of those venues. And I have a online program that I'm creating to work with the content in this book intensively for 3 months with a small group of people. So they can contact me, Connie at awakeningself.com. You can email me if you're interested in any of that.
That all sounds great. Thank you so much for coming onto the show, Connie. It's been an absolute delight. And
it's been delightful to be with you and Corey as well. It's just you guys are very engaging, and it's a really fun conversation.
We try.
You do.
We don't try, we just flow.
That's right. It's flow. It's divine flow through all of us.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And listeners, once again, you've been listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and tonight's guest, who was Connie Habash, where we've been talking about how to be calm and confident and deal with anxiety.
Yay.
Yay.
And you can catch us live on Tuesdays, 6 to 7 on CIVL, or you can...
probably better to try and reach us at 7 to 8.
Oh. 7 to 8 on Tuesday, or catch the Evergreen podcast version on drlesliephillips.com.
And that's Pacific time, by the way.
Yes.
Thank you, Leslie. Corey.
Thank you. See you next week, folks. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to another Unlocking Your Truth podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips. For more information, go to our website at drlesleyphillips.com. That's drlesleyphillips.com, where you can ask questions or send her an email, and there's many free gifts on there for you as well. You can also find the questions that were asked during this show at the website on our free card reading podcast page, where you'll find a full list of them. Come back again.